Hi, I'm Markku Wilenius, and I'm going to tell you about my prediction of the future technologies. Future technologies, as will be using them, is very different to what we are seeing today, because we're going to change since our needs, desires, the goals of our societies are in a rapid transformation. And with that, we're going to see some exciting new technologies. And I'm going to tell you what is my vision about it. But before that time, we need to understand that technology has always been with human beings. So we started to use probably some 2.5 million years ago, pieces of stone, pieces of bone for making food, making shelters, fighting whatever that was needed. So then and there appeared the first technology. In the antique times, people, when they were referring to the technology, they were also not just talking about the gadget, so to say, and the technique, but they were also talking technology as an art. So the way we design and form was an essential part of the technology as understood in the antique times. When the modern times started, then what happened? We started to create a kind of a society that were sort of suddenly picking up on a fast rate different technologies. So that was that, and by that we say that these were the first signs of modern society. Industrialization, by some standards, started to occur a little more than 200 years ago on an accelerating rate. And one way to look at this, which is the way I like very much, is that actually it started to happen in the waves. There were different waves, and each of those waves, which were about 40 to 60 years old long, they implied certain technologies. So first there was the steam technologies, then the steel and the railways. Later in the 19th century came then the electrification, the chemicals were founded, then came automobiles, then came ICT and digitalization. So that's a kind of a rough version of how different technologies came and built our society. But it was not only those technologies that was important, but the way they actually changed our ways of life, our ways of work, our ways of running our everyday life, because that was what was impacted. Now, when technologies are being invented, that's one thing. But when we actually start to apply those technologies, it's another thing. And the history of technology tells us that basically every technology that we have ever invented has actually turned out, when we start to tame it, when we start to use it, when we start to apply it, turn out to be rather different than what originally those inventors were thinking of. For instance, when Graham Bell invented the telephone, and some other people at his time were coming up with a similar invention. It was first thought not as a tool for communication, but rather as a tool for signaling something into the distant positions or a distant organization and people. And the fact that it became a communication tool just occurred sort of a much later time. Even more recently, when text message was invented by a Finnish inventor, actually, somewhere early 80s, it was not thought as a communication tool first, but it was thought to reach your phone box in a convenient way. if you are traveling abroad. Now, this taming of the technology is a hugely interesting thing, particularly when we think about what is happening next, because we see a lot of new technologies appearing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, Internet of Things, blockchain, and actually many others. But the point is that while we are moving into using these type of technologies, we again do this kind of a bit of a strange shift into areas what we perhaps have not thought about that we're gonna be applying them for. What is gonna happen, for instance, in the area of artificial intelligence? So today we think that we're gonna apply it into everything where we are either producing or disseminating information, having a communication between the machines in different ways, and so forth and so forth. And while that is also going to be happen, maybe we're gonna get some totally new interpretations how we use artificial intelligence. For instance, in finding the ways how we can actually create a much better energy systems, how we can actually communicate between human beings in a much more efficient way, and so forth and so forth. So the future of how we use the technologies has to be understood in the context of where are we going as societies? Where are those needs that need to be met? So when the first microcomputers and later mobile phones were invented in the previous wave, which is the fifth wave, extending from, say, 1970s to 2010, what happened was that we essentially create a new communication infrastructure. And because we liked it to be build it in a way that really enable much more effective communication and much more effective way of dealing with the data and the information, it turned out to be very different to what those early pioneers in 1970s who were building these first information and communication infrastructure thought. They thought at that time mostly, and there is a lot of evidence to this, that the world of their time will be kind of inhabited by these computers which are not going to be on each other's home as it is now. We're not going to see them in our homes, but rather they're going to be placed in a certain places in our countries where we have some sort of a connection, but the intelligence will be there in this centralized system. Now we know by now that what actually happened was that this whole system of digital technologies got decentralized instead of being centralized. So very different to what was the point. Now, anyway, the intention was very much to create this new communication system which makes society much more communicative, much more informed, and much more efficient in terms of labor productivity. Now when we move on from here to the sixth wave, again we need to ask, what is the type of the need for which we are creating those technologies and for which we are taming those technologies? And very important aspect of that is that when we look at the world at large, there is one really big unmet need that we can observe, and that need is that we are squandering our resources. We are wasting our resources. The world is now in a big trouble because we haven't really found how to use our resources, particularly the natural resources, but also I would say the human resources, much more efficient way. And because we haven't put much stakes on those, we are hugely inefficient. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at for instance, that how we are using our cars in our everyday life. Now, we can see that when we have a car at home and you take like a 24-hour slot, how much of that 24 hours you are actually using your car? I believe that it's in the matter of somewhere between 0 and let's say maximum 3 hours. How much is that out of the 24 hours that we have that car at disposal? So that's just the one example how inefficiently we are using, because in an efficient society we are not doing that in that way. We are not owning each other these cars which are laying dormant for most of the time. We have created a system where we can get a vehicle that takes us from A to B when we need that. But then when we don't need that, somebody else can use that. And we don't have to have all these kind of steel boxes sort of dormant laying around. It's a very stupid, inefficient system. And we are awakening to that now because of the resource depletion, because of the climate change, because of this incredible destruction that is going on in the world when it comes to ecosystems which are mostly now suffering from over-exploitation done by human beings. Isn't there clearly then a message so that when we move from here to the next phase of the society, say towards 2050, we need to do something to change this, because in the future people would look at our societies currently and laugh, wow, how ancient the stuff is that we are working on. In a similar way that we are looking at this Colosseum here and thinking that, well, looks a bit kind of old and rudimentary in a way. And that is what is really happening right now. So this idea of building more intelligent into the way that we are using technologies, more resource efficiency, whether we are talking about the materials, whether we're talking about the energy, whether we're talking about the human capital, that's where we're going to be focusing on the next 2 or 3 decades very intensively. And all those technologies, what I counted earlier, blockchain, AI, Internet of Things, machine learning, you name it. One way or another, we're gonna gear those technologies, the uses of those technologies, into these goals and the targets, because we're gonna be building the economic incentives for those in the global sense and in the country-wise. And that's where the new markets will be appearing, and that's where the investment will be flowing. And we have seen the kind of a beginning of that. So the way that we can actually make a forecast about the future technologies, as said, should be based on the very idea that the future indeed is about the new technologies, but the way that we tame those technologies for our use, the way that we can start actually applying those technologies, has to do about more broader goals that our societies have. And with that, we're going to see a lot of surprises, because again, when the technologies are invented, they are invented at one time, but when we are applying them, we are moving on and we are living constantly in the different times, which makes it also that the uses of technologies will change. So there's going to be a lot of surprises. Of course, also I must say that the using of the space technology, as it has been ever since it was sort of seriously invented in the 50s and 60s, it's also going to be a big kind of a contributor to the future of technologies, because in that, we are really seeing just the beginning. And it's going to be very interesting where we are with those space technologies in 2050. But when it comes to the new materials, new energy sources, a lot of invention will come from that source.